My name is Daniel Reeves, and before I tell you what happened with my barn, I need you to understand something about the land I live on. My grandfather bought 16 acres in 1962, back when this part of the county was nothing but farmland and gravel roads. He built a barn on that property with his own two hands, board by board, over the course of 2 summers. My father grew up feeding livestock in that barn. I grew up climbing in its hayloft. And when my grandfather passed, the land came to me, along with a deed that was as clean and clear as any piece of paper could be. Fast forward to 3 years ago. The county had grown. Subdivisions crept closer and closer to what used to be open farmland, and eventually a new development called Meadow Ridge Estates went up directly bordering my property line. I want to be fair here. Most of the people who moved into Meadow Ridge were perfectly nice. We waved at each other. Some of them even asked if they could buy fresh eggs from my chickens. But there was one resident who made it her personal mission to turn my life into a nightmare, and her name was Denise Calloway. Denise was the president of the Meadow Ridge Homeowners Association. Now, my property was never part of that HOA. My grandfather's 16 acres existed before Meadow Ridge was ever a blueprint, and my deed had no HOA covenant attached to it whatsoever. I want to make that point crystal clear right from the start, because it's the entire foundation of this story. I owed the Meadow Ridge HOA nothing. Not dues, not compliance, not so much as a nod in a meeting. But try telling that to Denise. It started small, the way these things always do. Denise would walk her dog along the edge of my property and stop to stare at my barn like she was inspecting a crime scene. Then she started leaving notes in my mailbox, not the HOA's official mailbox, mind you, my personal mailbox, on my property that had nothing to do with her association. The notes were things like, "Your barn does not match our community's aesthetic guidelines, and please paint your barn to comply with Meadow Ridge exterior standards." The first time I got one of these notes, I laughed. I genuinely thought it was a joke, maybe a prank from one of my nephews. But then Denise showed up at my door in person, clipboard in hand, wearing a look on her face like she was about to inspect a restaurant kitchen for health code violations. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I'm here regarding the barn on your property. As you may know, Meadow Ridge has strict guidelines about structures visible from community sightlines, and your barn is, frankly, an eyesore that's affecting our property values." I stood there for a moment just trying to process what she'd said. "Denise," I told her, "I'm not part of your HOA. My land isn't in Meadow Ridge. Never has been." She gave me this tight little smile, the kind of smile people give you when they've already decided you're wrong and nothing you say will change their mind. "Actually," she said, "under our updated bylaws, any structure within visual range of the community that could be reasonably interpreted as a shared or community-facing building falls under our review authority. Your barn, being visible from at least 4 homes in Phase 2, qualifies." I remember blinking at her. A shared or community-facing building. Denise, it's a barn. It's my personal barn. I store hay in it. Sometimes my tractor. It is not a community building. "Well, it's certainly community visible," she replied, tapping her pen against the clipboard like she was scoring points in a debate only she knew the rules to. "And visibility creates obligation, Mr. Reeves. That's simply how these things work in a well-managed community." I asked her, as politely as I could manage, who exactly had granted her the authority to make that determination. She told me the board had discussed it during an executive session, which I would later learn was a fancy way of saying she and maybe one other person had talked about it over coffee and decided it sounded official enough to act on. "That's your interpretation," she said, and then she handed me a printed page from what she called the Meadow Ridge Homeowners Association Design Standards Handbook, pointed to a paragraph, and said, "Right there, community building." I'd hate for this to escalate, Mr. Reeves, but the board takes these matters very seriously. I took the paper, mostly because I wanted her off my porch, and I told her I'd look into it. She left with a satisfied little nod, like she'd just won some kind of battle. Little did she know, she'd just started a war she had no business fighting. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. Denise began sending what she called official violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. She claimed my barn's red paint was not an approved community color. She claimed the gravel path leading to my barn was a shared access easement that needed to be properly maintained per HOA standards. She even claimed, at one point, that my barn's weather vane was a safety hazard to community aircraft, which I can only assume meant the occasional drone some kid in Meadow Ridge liked to fly around. One notice claimed my chicken coop, which sits nearly 200 feet from my property line, was attracting pests that could migrate into Meadow Ridge yards. Another claimed the sound of my rooster crowing in the early morning violated a noise ordinance that, as far as I could tell, existed only in Denise's imagination. Each notice arrived in the same manila envelope, printed on the same letterhead she'd clearly designed herself, complete with a little clip art image of a farmhouse in the corner that had nothing to do with the actual architectural style of Meadow Ridge Estates. I started keeping every single one of these notices in a folder, not because I thought I'd ever need them, but because at a certain point it became almost comical, like collecting strange little artifacts from a woman who seemed determined to invent an entire regulatory system just for my 16 acres. Looking back, that folder ended up being more useful than I ever could have imagined. Each notice came with a threat of fines. Fees. For a barn that had stood on my grandfather's land, completely outside her jurisdiction, for over 60 years. I tried reasoning with her the first few times. I even attended one of the Meadow Ridge HOA meetings as a guest, just to clear the air. That meeting was an experience I won't forget anytime soon. I stood up during the open floor portion and calmly explained that my property was not part of the Meadow Ridge subdivision, that my deed predated the development by decades, and that I had no legal obligation to comply with any HOA standard whatsoever. I even offered to show anyone in the room my deed and plat map right then and there on my phone. Denise, sitting at the head table like she was presiding over a courtroom, cut me off. Mr. Reeves, with all due respect, the board has already reviewed this matter internally and determined that your barn functions as a de facto community structure due to its visibility and its historical use for what we believe were once community gatherings. I nearly laughed out loud. Community gatherings? The only gatherings that Barn had ever hosted were my grandfather's card games with 3 of his war buddies back in the 70s. I told her as much. She waved it off and said the board's determination stood regardless of my personal recollection, and that if I didn't bring the barn into compliance within 30 days, they would proceed with fines and potentially pursue what she called further legal remedies. A murmur went through the room when Denise made that claim about the card games. A few of the older residents actually turned to look at each other, clearly as skeptical as I was. One man near the back, who I later learned had lived in the area even longer than some of the original Meadow Ridge developers, raised his hand and said, "Denise, with respect, I don't think you can just decide something was a community gathering 60 years after the fact." Denise brushed him off with a tight smile and moved on to the next agenda item like the conversation had never happened. I left that meeting angrier than I think I'd ever been. Not because I was scared. I knew, deep down, that she had absolutely no authority over my property. What made me angry was the sheer audacity of it. The confidence with which she lied to an entire room full of her neighbors, dressing up a personal vendetta as official HOA business, betting that I'd be too intimidated or too ignorant of my own rights to push back. Driving home that night, I kept replaying the meeting in my head. I thought about my grandfather, about the sweat and the splinters and the 2 summers he'd spent building that barn board by board, hauling lumber in an old pickup truck that barely ran. I thought about how absurd it was that someone who had lived in this county for maybe 5 years was standing in front of a room lecturing me about a structure that predated her entire subdivision by decades. That barn had survived droughts, storms, and one particularly nasty tornado scare back in the 90s. It was not about to be brought down by a woman with a clipboard and a made-up handbook. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and made a decision. If Denise wanted to play this game with official documents and official-sounding language, then I was going to beat her at her own game using the most official documents there are, county records. The next morning, I drove down to the county clerk's office. I requested a certified copy of my property deed, going all the way back to the original 1962 purchase by my grandfather. I also requested the recorded plat map for the entire area, which clearly showed my 16 acres as a separate, standalone parcel, completely outside the boundaries of what would later become Meadow Ridge Estates. And just to be thorough, I requested the recorded plat and covenant documents for Meadow Ridge itself, the actual legal paperwork that defined which parcels were bound by the HOA and which weren't. The clerk, a patient woman named Sharon who had clearly seen every kind of property dispute imaginable, pulled the files for me without so much as blinking. "Let me guess," she said as she printed everything out. "HOA trying to claim jurisdiction over land that was never part of the development." "How'd you know?" I asked. She laughed. "Happens more than you'd think. People move into these developments and suddenly think the HOA rules apply to the whole county. Don't worry, the paperwork doesn't lie." Sharon walked me through the documents one by one, pointing out the recording stamp on my grandfather's original deed, dated clean and legible despite being over 60 years old. She showed me the plat map, a large folded document that laid out the entire area the way it had been surveyed decades earlier, with my grandfather's 16 acres marked as a distinct, separate parcel with its own number, completely outside the boundary lines that would eventually be redrawn for Meadow Ridge Estates when it was developed years later. Then she pulled the recorded declaration of covenants for Meadow Ridge itself, a thick document running dozens of pages, filed with the county when the subdivision was first platted. She flipped to the section listing every lot and parcel number bound by the association's authority. I scanned the list twice, just to be absolutely certain. My parcel number wasn't there. It had never been there. There was no ambiguity, no grey area, no room for interpretation. The document simply didn't include my land, because my land had never been part of what the developers sold to the HOA in the first place. You want certified copies of all of this? Sharon asked. Every last page, I told her. She was right. The paperwork told a story that Denise's clipboard full of official violation notices simply couldn't compete with. My deed was recorded decades before Meadow Ridge Estates even existed as a legal entity. The plat map showed my property with a clean, unmistakable boundary line separating it from a subdivision. And most importantly, the Meadow Ridge HOA's own recorded covenants, the actual legal document filed with the county, not the handbook Denise liked to wave around, explicitly listed every parcel bound by the association. My grandfather's 16 acres wasn't on that list. It had never been on that list. It could never be on that list, because it wasn't part of the development. I made copies of everything. Certified, county-stamped copies. And then I did something I probably should have done from the very beginning. I called an attorney. I found a real estate attorney in town named Marcus Whitfield, a calm, no-nonsense guy who'd handled property disputes for over 20 years. I laid out the whole situation for him, the notes in my mailbox, the ridiculous violation notices, the accusation that my barn was somehow a community building, and the veiled threats of fines and legal action. I brought my folder of collected notices, along with the certified county documents, and spread them across his desk like evidence at a trial. He listened patiently, occasionally jotting notes, flipping through the violation notices with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief, and when I finished, he just shook his head and smiled. "Daniel," he said, "I've seen a lot of HOA overreach in my career, but claiming a privately owned barn on non-member land is a community building? That's a new one. You have absolutely nothing to worry about here. Your county records are airtight." Marcus drafted a letter that I will never forget for the rest of my life, because it was, in its own polite and lawyerly way, an absolute masterpiece. It was addressed to Denise Calloway and the entire Meadow Ridge Homeowners Association board. The letter then addressed, one by one, every single violation Denise had cited: the paint color, the gravel path, the weather vane, and yes, the claim that the barn was a community building. For each one, Marcus methodically explained why the HOA had no legal standing to make such a claim, and reminded the board that continuing to send violation notices, threaten fines, or otherwise harass a non-member property owner could expose the association, and potentially its individual board members, to legal liability for harassment and tortious interference. The letter closed with a simple, direct request: cease all further contact regarding my property, remove any and all fines or violations logged against a parcel that was never under the HOA's jurisdiction, and provide written confirmation that the matter was closed. Before we sent it, Marcus attached copies of every certified county document as exhibits: the deed, the plat map, and the relevant pages of the Meadow Ridge covenants with my missing parcel number circled for emphasis. "I like to make it easy for people to read the writing on the wall," he told me with a slight grin. "Saves everyone a lot of time and a lot of money." We sent that letter certified mail, with a copy also mailed directly to the HOA's management company, which handled their official correspondence. And then I waited. I want to tell you it ended quietly after that, but Denise wasn't the type of person to back down gracefully. About a week later, I got a call from a neighbor who told me Denise was going door to door in Meadow Ridge, telling people I was threatening to sue the HOA, and painting herself as some kind of victim standing up for community standards against an uncooperative outsider. I wasn't even angry when I heard that. At that point, it was almost comical. The real turning point came at the next official HOA board meeting. I wasn't there. I had no reason to be, since I wasn't a member, but a neighbor of mine, a genuinely kind woman named Patricia who lived on the edge of Meadow Ridge and had always thought Denise's crusade against my barn was ridiculous, attended and later told me everything that happened. Apparently, one of the other board members, a man named Gary who had been quietly skeptical of Denise's claims from the start, had done some digging of his own after receiving a copy of my attorney's letter. Gary pulled the same county records I had, the recorded covenants, the plat maps, and presented them to the rest of the board during the meeting. According to Patricia, the room went dead silent as Gary read off the exact parcel numbers listed in the HOA's own governing documents, none of which matched mine. Denise reportedly tried to argue that the spirit of the community standards should extend to visually adjacent properties regardless of what the paperwork said. But another board member, a retired schoolteacher named Linda, apparently cut her off and said something along the lines of, "Denise, the county doesn't care about the spirit of anything. They care about what's recorded. And what's recorded says his property was never ours to regulate. We could be sued for this, and honestly, we'd deserve it." The board voted, right then and there, to formally rescind every single violation notice issued against my property, to send a written apology, and, this is the part one still find satisfying every time I think about it, to review Denise's conduct as HOA president, given that she had apparently been sending these notices under the guise of official board authority without ever actually bringing the matter to a vote in the first place. A few days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA's management company. It confirmed that all violations against my property were void, apologized for what they called an administrative overreach, and assured me no further correspondence regarding my barn or any other structure on my land would be sent. Attached to the letter was a copy of the board meeting minutes, which openly stated that Denise Calloway had acted outside her authority and that the association's legal counsel had advised the board that continued action could have resulted in a harassment claim. I'd love to tell you Denise apologized to me personally, but that's not how these stories usually end in real life. Instead, I heard through the grapevine, mostly from Patricia, who kept me pretty well updated, that Denise's standing within the HOA took a serious hit. She'd built her entire reputation in that community around being the person who kept standards high and protected property values, and this whole ordeal exposed her as someone who had been making up rules and stretching the truth to suit her own preferences. A few months later, at the next HOA election, she didn't run for re-election as president. Patricia said it wasn't exactly a secret why. There was one more small moment that stuck with me, one Patricia told me about almost as an afterthought. Apparently, at that same meeting where the board voted to rescind the violations, Gary the board member asked Denise directly, in front of everyone, whether any of the other violations she'd issued over the years, to actual HOA members, not just to me, had ever been properly reviewed by the full board or simply issued on her own authority. According to Patricia, Denise didn't have a good answer, and the silence in that room apparently said more than any argument could have. A few residents later requested their own past violations be reviewed, and at least 2 fines, unrelated to me entirely, ended up being refunded. I never gloated about any of it, and I made a point not to bring it up if I happened to run into Denise around town. There didn't seem to be much use in rubbing salt in a wound that the county records had already cut clean on their own. A few months after the whole thing settled down, I did run into her once at the local hardware store. She gave me a stiff, polite nod, and I gave one right back. That was the end of it. No apology, no conversation, just 2 neighbors quietly acknowledging that the matter was closed. As for me, life went back to normal pretty quickly. My barn is still standing exactly where it's always stood, still painted the same red it's been since my grandfather first put a coat on it, still hosting nothing more community-oriented than my tractor, some hay bales, and the occasional barn cat.
No fines. No violations.
No more notes in my mailbox. My barn still gets the occasional curious glance from someone new to the neighborhood, especially since the story made its way around Meadow Ridge as something of a cautionary tale. A new family moved in a few months back, and the wife mentioned to me at the mailbox one afternoon that she'd heard the barn story during her HOA orientation, framed as an example of why the board now requires any violation notice to be approved by a full board vote and documented with a citation to the actual recorded covenants before it's ever sent out. Apparently, my little dispute with Denise ended up reshaping how that HOA operates going forward, which is a strange kind of legacy for a barn to have, but I'll take it. But I'll be honest with you, this whole experience taught me something important, something I think is worth sharing with anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA that seems to think its authority stretches further than it actually does. HOAs, even the well-meaning ones, only have as much power as their recorded legal documents give them. Not their handbooks. Not their bylaws that get updated on a whim without a proper vote. Not the personal opinions of whoever happens to be sitting in the president's chair that year. Their actual recorded declaration of covenants, filed with the county, and nothing more. If you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, where someone from an HOA, or frankly anyone, tries to claim authority over your property that doesn't seem right, don't just take their word for it. Don't get intimidated by official-sounding letters or clipboards or confident tones. Go straight to the source. Go to your county clerk's office, or your county's online records portal if they have one, and pull your deed, your plat map, and if relevant, the HOA's actual recorded covenants. Those documents don't lie, they don't have opinions, and they don't care how confident the person across from me sounds. They simply state the facts, in black and white, filed and stamped by the county for anyone to see. Denise Calloway spent months trying to convince me, and everyone around her, that my grandfather's barn was somehow a community building subject to her association's rules. She had a clipboard. She had a handbook she'd probably written herself. She had a confident voice and an entitled attitude. But in the end, none of that mattered, because the county records told a different story, the true story, the one that had been sitting quietly on file since 1962, waiting for someone to actually take the time to look it up. And that, at the end of the day, is the story of how a stack of certified paperwork from a county clerk's office quietly, calmly, and completely dismantled an HOA president's months-long crusade against a barn that was never hers to claim in the first place. If you've ever dealt with an HOA overstepping its bounds, or a neighbor who thought their opinion carried the weight of law, I'd love to hear about it. These stories always remind me that the truth, especially when it's written down and filed with the county, has a way of winning out in the end. And every once in a while, on a quiet evening, I still walk out to that barn, run my hand along one of the old wooden beams my grandfather set in place with his own two hands, and think about how close I came to letting someone else rewrite the story of that land simply because she said it with enough confidence. I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I drove down to that county clerk's office instead of just paying a fine to make the noise stop. Because in the end, the truth was never really in question. It was sitting quietly in a filing cabinet the whole time, waiting for someone to bother looking.